this is a very, I mean, we're very glad to have Michael and Sue here. We're missing a fourth person who unfortunately comes in tomorrow morning, Karen Sito. We were hoping that Karen was there because they're part of a, let's say, a small cabal of people or a large one that have been trying to work on trying to redefine how we can look at where urban areas and urbanization and a whole range of processes are across the world. We come from very different geographies and we come from different but very similar backgrounds. I mean, the fascinating thing about Michael, apart from the fact that he's an Oxford Don, is that he's been a practicing mayor for a long period of time. So he's been an active politician in the City of London, which again you don't find. I mean, you do find a number of academics in politics, from Angela Merkel to others, unnamed, but in the local government sphere, the moving back and forth, excepting in some countries. You go to Brazil, you find a lot of moving back and forth between USP and the mayor of Sao Paulo and Rio and stuff like that. But to have somebody who's of active experience of dealing with the day-to-day management of municipal affairs and the politics of managing that is really important, apart from his sort of world ranking role in the area of anthropology, social sciences and urban areas. Sue has spent much of her life, most recently and otherwise, chasing around between Africa and Europe. She's between the University of Cape Town and the University of Bristol at the current point of time. And again, somebody who's a heterodox academic and also a heterodox practitioner, been involved in some of the most critical points of negotiation in the global framework in this space for a long time. So, most of us have a fair deal of engagement with stuff that happens in terms of actual transformation or changes on the ground, and all of the rarification as that goes all the way up into global circles and becomes vaporware or whatever it is that happens in various places. But on the other hand, the framing and, let's say, the epistemic sort of that sit behind that are very, very important, as we will try and play out today. So in some senses, this play around new urban science, there is no urban science and it's not really new. People have been doing this for a long time. But this version of this reconstruction is an attempt to try and reorganize the epistemic basis and in many ways the locations for this to actually happen. Location has got a lot to do with engagement, especially those from the global south. So having said that, I'm going to hand over to Michael, who's going to pick up and run with it, and then I'll run for a bit and then Sue will come in. So it'll be for those of us who are from India, a little bit of a jugalbandi in some senses. Let's see how it goes. Oops. Yeah, he's going to put your slide up. Full screen. Yeah, great.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks for the chance to speak. I'm going to speak for a minute or so. I think it's widely recognised, very straightforward, that if you look at the globe over the last 3 decades,
Mike, you might want to use Mike.
Sorry, if you look at if you look at the globe over the last 3 decades, the very high proportion of urban growth has taken place in what's commonly cited as the global south, but also we're talking about China, we're talking about places outside the conventional European, North American imaginary for cities. But equally, it is the case that I think there is, as Ari just suggested, a widespread acknowledgement now that if we are to think differently about the urban, then we need to think simultaneously about the commonality of urban processes alongside the singularity of urban histories, but also alongside the geographical diversity of forms of expertise through which the city is made visible. And I guess in that context and in that spirit, we put together a program which has hopefully the catchy title Peak Urban, which is a play slightly on peak oil, obviously, but is an acronym which we hope to explain in part of what we're doing today. It's a partnership which is fundamentally organised around the reality that I'm sure everyone in this room will recognise straightforwardly, that cities are at the heart of the SDGs, not only in terms of the urban SDG, but in terms of the reality of the major global challenges that are social, economic, and climate change oriented, all of which will be realized in and through cities. It's a partnership that actually brings together work across 4 university teams, one set of colleagues who are here in Colombia at the University of Airfit in Medellin, colleagues from IIHS in Bangalore, also colleagues from where Sue used to be and still is at University of Cape Town, and from Peking University, Beijing Dashui in China, alongside a team from the University of Oxford. So five countries, 5 universities focusing on 4 cities, with a very strong commitment both to recognize the need to produce new forms of engagement that cross conventional disciplinary boundaries, but alongside that, a strong sense that collaboration that is international must also be at the heart of the sorts of work that we're doing. And so the partnership crosses many countries, but to introduce the kind of that ethos and to bridge from ethos to practice, Ara's going to say a little bit more about what this means in the context of IIHS work.
Yeah. So if I can do that, do you mind? I'll probably. Can we cut the lights a little bit, because I'm going to run you through a whole string of slides, and yeah, hopefully Sue and Michael, you don't have to crane your necks too much. Yeah, click, please. No, just, yeah, not too much. Just a little bit. As much as these guys need. Let them decide what to get on. So what I'm going to do quite quickly here, and for those of you who think I may be waving my hands too much, because I'm going to tell you a story, and I'm going to tell it really fast. The critical thing is not to abuse the gestalt and not the details here, is that this is based on a hell of a lot of high-end science that's come out in the last 3 months. From across the world is on the table here. I will refer to these 3 major reports, including one that Sue and Karen Sito co-led that came out just before Christmas from London, from the Nature Stable, on the science and the future of cities. So what I'm going to be basically doing is looking at the frame that some of us work with. It's not a very good frame, but it tends to work. Sue and I were part of the sort of turning point on very, very cold day, I guess in January of 2014, where essentially the idea that we should have a separate goal within this global framework that looks at universal delivery of no poverty, zero hunger, universal healthcare, quality education, etc., and clean water sanitation, is that we brought in this thing which actually doesn't sticks in the throat of this framework, which is this idea about place and community. And we did that through a very complex political process, and hence this is a very messy framework. From an academic point of view, it's really, it's not workable, it's not orthogonal, you can't measure things, it's a complex network. But the practical reality is that this is politically negotiated, and 173 countries signed up to it, and some of them are trying to do something about it, and the rest of them are ashamed when the heads of state actually land up and they look at other people and see that they're at the bottom end of the ladder in some senses. So the question for us was, since we were forced into one box, while in actual fact, urbanities encompass all of this stuff. The retreat to the one box was a tactical retreat. We knew that if you have to enable sustainability across the world, and especially in urban areas, you have to deal with poverty, you have to deal with jobs, you have to deal with education, you have to deal with healthcare, water, everything more or less on that train. But we retreated into that space because we realized that it was impossible to be able to crane the other silos and have this as a mainstream activity. The challenge in an epistemic space, when you're dealing with the complex politics of implementation and actually enable things happening, you have, two bipolar choices. It's not really good. One is to mainstream the process, and that happened for many, many years around gender, and that was in some senses very difficult. And I think a big achievement here is to have goal 5 up, so all the run up from when we saw it in Beijing, etc. So that's the frame that we're working with. The question, of course, is how do you actually operationalize this process? Can you actually put a little bit of knowledge behind it? Is there a science that connects the multiple networks that hold this stuff together? So this is the framework that we're using in PEAK in some senses. So basically, they're established and known disciplines. the existing canon in the urban space around a whole range of things. The means are for us are urban living, which in some sense the humanities relate to, institutional capacity, finance, law, capital, and governance, which is what a lot of the social sciences deal with, and a lot of natural science stuff that those of us who come from, the more quantitative disciplines, from modeling, math, physics, science deal with. So that's the whole range of established traditions which use established methods and canons to look at a whole range of really new and emerging spaces. City health and well-being. Where does it sit? How is it connected into other things? In India, we're having this significant challenge at the current point of time, where we have a rural healthcare system. We're now trying to translate that into urban space, and nobody has any idea where to start, how to problematize it, and put it together. Similarly, questions of city morphology and resilience, very, very critical to not only dealing with sprawl and employment. We see that in countries like South Africa around questions of apartheid and space, and resilience, which is tied to climate change, violence, and a whole range of things. And of course, technological change. So essentially what we're trying to do here is to pick up this epistemic set of networks, again another meme, and connect up the traditional disciplines which have evolved from a different world and a different imagination into this emergent new thing that we're trying to get some handle on. It's a very, very early stage kind of process here. So in some senses we're at the forefront of both of interesting inquiry and also of sort of lack of knowledge and understanding. And in some senses the core frame that we're trying to interrogate is this thing that is globally negotiated. As I said, problematic, great issues with it, a whole range of critiques that you can take from the left to the right, the north and the south, etc. But what we try to map is these sustainable development goals and how they can be sort of pulled together in some senses. The research streams that we're working with are trying to explore the network of connections between this and the knowledge networks, which in many cases were constructed for a different time and age. The question now is, in this emergent world, how would they actually have to be reorganized? And the implication, of course, in that is, how does the creation of knowledge have to be reorganized? Both in the practice of science, as we know it, in these spaces where you bring together humanities and social sciences and the hard sciences in ways that they haven't been brought together before, and also in the institutions in which the practice of the science has to be embedded. Because if you don't institutionalize them in a few thousand places across the world, if you don't build relationships between universities, city governments, civil society, movements, and enterprise at the local level, and connect that with what's happening globally, there is almost no chance the kind of changes that I'm going to run you through very quickly can actually happen in practice. So it's really something that's driven by the imperative for change on the ground. We have a whole range of interesting ways of trying to connect these things up. You'll see obviously a connection between the canonical disciplines in some senses and a whole range of cross-cutting areas in some ways, which many of us in our research work, in our practices, in our politics, have been trying to engage with and have found micro solutions to in particular niches of this multidimensional matrix, which can be looked at by discipline, by geography, by scale, by stakeholder, and by some sort of epistemic and practice community. So we're trying to get some sense of this process. It's part of this sort of grand challenge kind of frame. And within that, as Michael will deal with later, there are four big things we're looking at. One, of course, look at the question of the sciences of prediction and projection. So not looking at ex ante, because one of the big challenges for us in a world that's changing so quickly is how do you actually project? How does one sort of enable the process of proposition, even within the natural sciences, which are not used to doing that at objects that are quite close. And then, of course, the question of emergence, complex adaptive systems with dissipative structures, stuff that we've seen happening in physics and chemistry maybe 30 or 40 years ago, but how does that actually permeate not only into natural systems but human systems and the interface, especially in the socio-ecological frame. The question of innovation, which is very critical, and how innovation actually happens, how it can be enabled, scaled, etc. And then, of course, to make this possible, how do you enable the scaffolding of knowledge exchange, which, of course, is, again, the institutional and epistemic question. How do you build these communities of knowledge and epistemic to make this kind of process forward? We're trying to do this through observatories in 4 cities, Beijing, Bangalore, Cape Town, and Medellin. So having said that, I'm going to quickly run you through, like I said, this is an example of the kind of stuff that's happening. This is a report which will probably here for those of you who need bedtime reading and stuff to fall asleep with. So this is one of the most advanced pieces of science that's been done most recently. Very strong on the urban side, published in October 2018. This is, in some senses, a little bit of what the new science might look like. So those of us who come from the disciplines of, let's say, physics and medical sciences and neuroscience and stuff like that, for those of us who've done publication in that space, if you get 100 comments, even if it's for a top ranking journal like Science, and you consider yourself overly blessed. When you get 42,000 comments like we got, the chapter that I led had 8,000 comments that came from peer review. You're in a completely different space. So the nature of how science is operating, and this is all publicly accessible stuff. So when as authors, we respond to the comments that are available on our website. We have colleagues in the back who've been doing this stuff with us now. It's a completely different way of doing things because it's science in the public domain. It's continuously open to contest, not only by other scientists, but a whole range of people who are not necessarily in science. In fact, much of this is about politics, about whether you're an oil exporting country or not, etc., etc. And then the other cycle, which we're not used to in the area of science, of responding to public, accolades or brickbats in some sense. So when a scientific process like this receives 30,000 media responses, and you're playing whatever it is, cricket, T10 or something like that, every day for about 3 months. It's a different way of doing stuff. So we know things are changing. The question is, how do we institutionalize this process and also maintain the integrity of knowledge creation and the canon at the same time? And keeping that balance, I think, is a critical thing. I'm just pointing this out to you because these are 3 things that I'm going to use as the underlying thing. So then we took that process, and in 6 weeks from the time the first the report was produced, we got a set of authors who actually produced some policy. I mean, that was something that was very surprising and really hard. The same guys who write the science, who write this stuff here, 1,700 citations per chapter, will go in and put a piece of paper together, 25 pages, which actually makes sense to ordinary people, and certainly to mayors who read this kind of stuff. This is the challenge that we are faced with in trying to iterate through and enable the connection between grounded, theory building and the reflection that's happening. And again, this is just one example. But what I'm saying is this is real. It happened. This was launched for COP because we were part of the negotiation. And just, I think, 10 days later, this report, which I'll show you in a second just now, on the science and future of cities was launched. This took a little longer. It took a year and a half, I guess, for us to produce. About, 2.5 dozen of us sitting together from different parts of the world, trying to understand what this space was like and what the challenges are. So the reason I'm showing this to you is what I'm talking to you about just now, when I'm going to be talking about the connection between the science and the empirics, the policy and the science policy interface, is actually based on rock solid evidence-based processes that meet pretty much all the standards that you would normally take for any sort of very, very high value, very good publication. So that's sort of the caveat on that. So I'll pick up on 4 very quick cases. The first one, of course, is around the climate story. So the question that we were trying to answer after the Paris Climate Accord was, the negotiations outsourced the question of whether we can reach 1.5 or not, because the negotiations were unable to reach that question. Basically, across the world, we agreed to getting to below 2. Most of the poor countries in the world, including India, G77 said that's not acceptable. They said, okay, the science guys will go out and answer the question of whether we can do 1.5. Basically, buying political time to have this happen. But what's sitting behind that is a very interesting question, and I'll take maybe 30 seconds to explore that. So there was a recent Nobel Prize in economics, or environmental economics. Anybody here remembers? Who, where, what? Okay, where are the economists in the room? No, environmental economists. Who is the environmental economist who got the Nobel Prize last year? Sorry? Yes, what did Nobel do? Okay, so not one. He got the Nobel Prize, of course. But he got one of the reasons that he got the Nobel was for a construction of his in the 1980s, which underpinned this entire process. It's called the integrated assessment model, where basically he built a framework which has been used historically by the IPCC to build these big science models and connect them with a whole range of economic sort of bags of tricks, which then determine carbon prices and a whole range of other things. That's a framework that he put into place, which was tied to something that some people talked about, the idea of a global commons. Fine. So there was a discussion about Garrett Harding's work and stuff like that earlier in the conference. Fine. And there was some reference to another Nobel laureate in economics. Sorry, yeah. So Lynn Ostrom. Fine. Some of us had the opportunity of working with her. So Lynn's work and Harding's work were very influential in this idea that the atmosphere is a commons. Fine. And it's interesting how the politics of that has worked itself out, because we've spent 25 years from 1992 in Rio trying to play out that game, and politically it hasn't worked. So the reason I'm pointing this out was two very robust pieces of work. Lynn's work is remarkable in many other spheres, but deeply problematic in how we need to address this particular problem, because this is a problem that has to be addressed both with top-down processes. That's what the framework of the Global Commons was about. You have an atmosphere, it can contain so much of carbon, so if you don't have enough carbon, I mean, if you have limited space for carbon, you've got to carve that up, and some countries get less and some countries get more, and they fought like hell about how to make that happen, and effectively nothing happened in the world. And then the whole process inverted itself in Bali, Copenhagen later, and finally in Paris, to say, look, we have to enable bottom-up processes both on the mitigation side, on the carbon and the energy side, but much more important in dealing with the mess that we've created in the last 25 years or so. Fine? So now we are faced with this very interesting space in which cities have emerged as a key emergent tactic in between to connect up the top-down process and bottom-up. So the reason I'm pointing this out is that many of these challenges we face both in the real world and operational in the life of cities and otherwise are often can be tied back to ideas that come from similar or other regimes. That's why I mentioned these two things I've said. So basically, very, very quickly, cities are places of opportunity, places of enterprise and hope amongst poverty, places which are highly contradictory, they're places of productivity and deep inequality at the same time. So they hold both those things together. If you only look at one side and the other, you're actually quite lost. Places of contest for a better life and a better world. That is Cairo in a different age, but a very significant one. The question for us was, are these places in which a climate transformation can be made in hard technical terms? Why? Because fossil fuels and urbanization have had a very close but difficult relationship for the last 150 years. They created the Industrial Revolution. They filled the cities with wonderful things which take us round and round in circles, in the city of great ambition. But the assumption there was that we have a limitless supply of assets. And that's what the play of peak and peak urban is about. Cities were so successful that starting from a very humble beginning, 1950, 0.75 billion people, $3 trillion of economic activity. 2010, 2.9 billion people, 30 trillion. Look at that number on the output side. I showed this to you before. And they were so aspirational. This is India's sort of aspirational where many of our cities should go to and never get to. And they proceeded to, by 2030, destroy the planet, $90 trillion of output, plus unintended consequences, SO2 emission levels across the world. That's driven by the process of urbanization. We can zoom into this and literally go down to individual points. So our real stranded assets, and this is the real question in economics and otherwise, are not coal-fired power plants. This is what the big debate is. How do we take out coal-fired power plants? Who's going to pay for it? Technology transfer. That's what the debate is. It's not coal-fired power plants. But our cities. If you are the mayor of whatever, we don't necessarily have a mayor of Mumbai, it's very big stuff, or New York, or any other coastal city. Think about having to move your shoreline back by 5 kilometers in the next 15 or 20 years. Think of what it means to do it. It's almost unimaginable, not only in terms of politics, but just the questions of economics and commerce. So this is one of our most significant challenges. So, we created the SDGs, then we got Paris, and we got the stuff that we produced. And what does that say? Here I'm trying to make the connection between the macro and the micro. The hidden story in that, in the 1.5 business, and nobody tells you this, is what we agreed in Paris was not to get us to 2. But if you add up all the bottom-up processes, it takes us to 2.9. And when we wrote the IPCC report in 2014, basically what we said was, 2 is damn serious, and at 2 and beyond, there's no difference between New York, London with the Thames Barrier, or Durban, or any other city in the world. It's 10 years of difference. It doesn't matter how much money you have, because the ecosystem services start collapsing. So what did we find? We're basically at 1 degree. We're going to reach 1.5 by the late 2030s. We need to reach net zero carbon emission by 2050, which means that we have to hit 70% reductions by 2030. By the time we're doing SDGs, we have to reduce 70% across the world, which means that if you're at very high emission levels, at 10 tons per capita, you have to probably drop more than that, okay? With the implications for human development, investment, quality of life, etc., etc., etc. Else, we have no issue. And we actually don't know in the science how long that evolution will last. So it's going to be 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and how deep it will go. Will it go to 2, 2.5, 3, 3 plus 3, etc., etc. What are the potential impacts? You can't see this very well, but I just read out this one single thing, which is I think the most deadly piece of information in that report in the New Science. At 1.5, the number of people that could be impacted in terms of agriculture and food security, about 40 million. Right? At 2 degrees, it is somewhere between 330 and 396 million, so basically 400 million. There's an order of magnitude difference in terms of impact of people on the food security and agriculture between 1.5 and 2. So in a sense, the science community has revised their view of saying 2 was a guardrail, to moving it back to saying 1.5 is really, really important for us. And we are experiencing this thing in this country. We have colleagues who actually work on this question. Yeah. And why is it critical to cities? Because cities don't produce food in most parts of the world. And we know that the things that upturn not only cities, but entire regimes are food prices and food riots. I mean, this is the entire history of a certain part of political science, etc. So overshoot is a very serious challenge. The question that we were trying to answer is, can we make the transition? And the answer that came from the science, all the hundreds of citations we looked at, was yes, we can, but maybe by the skin of the teeth. Right? But we need dramatic upscaled ambition and simultaneous implementation in a new partnership paradigm. And this is, I think, where the kind of science stuff is dealing with. This is what this report is talking about too. How do you build the knowledge infrastructure to start solving these problems in 5,000 places at the same time in 15 years' time? That's a new way of doing science. It's possible today because you have countries even like ours where 20% of the population who's much younger is going into higher education. So you have the ability to do it, which you never had before. You have the internet, you have lots of other things that connect. And the interesting and challenging thing is that we have to run 4 simultaneous transitions at the same time. The standard ones are energy, industry, land use, and ecosystems. The new one that has come onto the plate over the last 4 or 5 years, and that's why it's taken so long to explain this, is the opportunities that cities and infrastructure provide us to actually make this transition. Because in the global south, especially in East Asia, Southern Asia, and Africa, and the retrofit in Europe and North America and Latin America, a lot of the stuff is still not enough. If we get it right, we can actually make the change, we can make things move much, much faster. But there's a very serious challenge. This is where the question of the social science is coming. You have to do this across all sectors of the economy. You've got to do this across all levels. And you have to bring in a whole range of diverse stakeholders. So it's not about tech. It's not only about financing. It's about a whole range of other processes, and you have to do mitigation and adaptation, which is for climate scientists together. You can't do it separately. That's what the science is showing us at the moment. So how do we make this work together? I'm going to bring you images from across the world. Copenhagen, which brings together SDGs 7, 8, and 12. It's a small city. It's going to be carbon neutral in the next, 6 or 7 years. How do you do ecosystem transitions? You know the stuff from the UK, Michael. So similarly, how do you deal with region of food systems? Vancouver is a wonderful example for that. The big question, of course, is jobs. If we can't do this and create 600 million jobs, the regimes in many places are in deep trouble. This is irrespective of where you come from, our country or Europe or whatever it is. The question of how you address this, especially with all of this fancy, fluffy stuff about AI and the new industrial revolution and stuff, that the fundamental question is jobs. Housing is a great opportunity for both job creation and new ways of doing this thing, and dealing with energy and other processes. Obviously, sustainable water supply and services is critical. Restructuring transformation is important. I've just taken you through 12 of the SDGs. So you have to enable all of this together to be able to make the change happen, and also do this in a large number of places in some senses. We have a framework to do this. This is like deep science in some senses. This is where those 1,700 citations sit. We've actually looked at 48 different systems across the world. This is at global scale. The challenge for us is to operationalize that at national scale, move one level down to sub-national scale, and finally move one level down to operationalize this at city. So really linking the stuff together is part of the scientific process. We do not have this kind of information in many countries of the world. But we know what needs to get done to be able to create this stuff. We have the framework, we know where the gaps are, and how do we make this happen. The biggest question here is on the institutional development side. Governance, convergence on policies, building institutional capacity, changing around the funding. This is the thing that really shook us and created the big problem, both in Katowice, in Poland, and in COP24 and otherwise. It's going to cost us 6 times or 5 to 8 times what Paris agreed on, because we didn't actually have the information for us. So you can look at this and say, look, this is not possible. This is the pie in the sky stuff. Some silly people sitting in academic places and other stuff, you can copy these numbers out there. If you are a smart government or a very entrepreneurial company, you'll see this as a tremendous opportunity for economic output and also job creation. And I would say, China's been really, really far-sighted in this because that's where they put their money in. Simultaneously, and this is the big interesting question here. The question of climate is not different from the question of restructuring of how the global economy is going to work. Obviously, the energy is a central part of it, but also how the investment system works. Because we have to redirect something of the order of about $1 trillion worth of investments out of a whole range of, within quotes, dirty sectors into other ones. And that means a reworking of the global financial system. And the global financial system will not be reworked unless we actually rework the intergovernmental fiscal arrangements, starting from cities, because that's where the base of both taxation at one end, valuation in land markets, etc., actually sit and work. So it's a connection at both ends. You can't implement in cities unless you have the resources, unless you have the institutional capacity, unless you have the innovation capacity, unless you have the partnerships, like I mentioned earlier, between universities, between local governments, between local enterprise, between local civil society and movements. So I just skip all this stuff very quickly and move on to the next question. So when you move from global level, how do you start unbundling this? I'm going to fly this very quickly. This is work that we do. So how do you start localizing the SDGs for India? This is the state SDI dashboard that my colleagues have put together. So we actually rank every state, the urban areas in the country. So the first country that's actually done this. So we know exactly what's happening. Obviously the reds are not very good and the greens are much better than otherwise. We're looking now at the full extent, well not the full, there are about, I think there are 10 SDGs here, not all of them, we don't have data on any of them. We have the ways of actually measuring this thing now at state level because our data systems don't allow us to go below that. So one of the really important things that we're going to try and do in Bangalore and other places is to build the mechanics of doing this at city level. So you need to do this at global scale, at provincial scale or state scale in India and other countries, and at city scale, and you need to link them together to look at the connections, and you require the matrices and the analytical frames to deal with it. I'm going to skip through very quickly. And then, of course, we do a lot of work here on the analytics process of trying to understand by scale of urban areas. This is the x-axis on this. What are the key drivers of urbanization? Where do the levers actually lie? This sits on a very large database of 650,000 places odd that my colleagues have put together here, where we are able to map a whole range of processes. Of course, looking at literacy, and we look at what happens in literacy, what changes and what drives that. Or on economic output in some senses, where the wealth exists in the country, and you can see it's highly skewed in many parts. A lot of them are in the large metropolitan areas, and a lot of it is in southern India, while a lot of our population and economic challenges are in the north and the northeast. We have good ideas of how they're working on the scale, what drives this, is it how is it concentrated on a log scale in larger urban centers or the smaller ones. Also very critically, and this is one thing I'm surprised about because we have really talked about this in this conference about on the city and the region, on exclusion, on caste, on gender, and the whole range of the question. What is the game that plays itself out of that? So driving behind these things, there are a whole range of processes that you have to look at across the urban system. Of course, this is a very large urban system. This is going to be the largest population on the planet in about 10 years' time. And then, of course, you then need to drill that down through analytical work, where you start looking at city scale. This is just showing an element of when you're looking at change over time, in terms of land use. You have to do that in various other places. And the model in the room will be working on this kind of questions later. 2 different cities, or even this one, you can see how it's changed very, very dramatically in the last 15 years or so. So you have to ascend between scales to understand what's happening, and also look at how change is happening, what's driving it. There's a special sort of track on this in Greek, which is going to be led by two of my colleagues who are looking at this kind of question. I will close here very quickly with something that I started the conference with. It is a provocation. This is a piece of history I actually picked out this morning. The presentation that we made in 2014 when to the Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh. This is a state that was being, people not from India, which was being bifurcated at that point in time. It's a constitutional committee that I was a member of, on what needs to get done in terms of trying to rework the development policy of the state, figure out how infrastructure is going to be put out, and most important for them, to locate where they need to have. The reason I'm showing you this is that there are tangible connections between the analytical techniques that we use, sometimes loosely and fast in some ways, and actual practice. So this is the end of an interesting, interesting political process. We actually went in and negotiated between center and state at every district in the state. This is exactly what the Prime Minister, as the Chief Minister at that time, saw. So basically, what we were saying there, that bifurcation is a great, interesting new opportunity, but The idea that he had, which has been implemented just now, of concentrating resources in one place may not be a very good one. And how do you open that up? So very quick, I'll run this story through very quickly. So you have a sort of steady but stabilizing population, but the challenge here, of course, is low literacy, a high dependency ratio, low urbanization. And the question then is, how do you maintain a 7% growth rate and whatever it is, create 0.2 million to 0.3 million new jobs with that form of urbanization, investment, and process as far as it's concerned. So we were asking in this larger development question there, and which sectors do you put your money in, because he was elected to perform that job. There was a lot of analytical work. I'm just sectioning it very quickly. So basically, there's strong aspirations of becoming a prosperous state, but significant regional development. So within that state, massive differences in regional development potential, very detailed analytical work that was done right across this, across many indicators, across numbers that are there. And of course, the interesting thing is, you have to look at settlement structure in detail, because if you don't get the speciality, this is what we're trying to bring into the development and the climate and the other science discourses. If you don't get the spatial pattern in, it's almost impossible to try and operationalize it in this context. So this is exactly what we told him. We said, this is a unique state. It's not like the early one that you had, where you put everything in more or less into Hyderabad. It is geographically dispersed in its economic and its settlement landscape, and that could be turned into a strategic advantage for the 21st century, because the cutting edge technologies of the 21st century are about decentralization, about networks, and not about concentration. It's a story of decentralized infrastructure and not bringing all your energy into one location and building this megacity which is 10 million large and can be significantly productive. And of course, the question of economic development, we looked at the economy and how it could be can be balanced across a whole range of other processes by sector. This is drilled down to district by district level. We look at the regional differences. You can see massive differences between the more developed and more invested north and the south, which is where the political tensions were coming from. You then try and link economic output to workforce to try and see where it can be put together, because speciality, locating new investment, new infrastructure, new places has a dramatic difference on actually what happens in that process. We laid out a framework which actually he's tried to implement in the last 5 years in some sense around these 4 big networks around urban clusters and economic corridors. We showed him how oil and gas would work itself out, how his road network would be built, etc., etc. But we had a fundamental difference of opinion with him and whatever, the colleagues, on where you should invest in. What he was saying was, decentralized. You can use government employment as a minor contributor to economic activity. This is not going to be able to build a new Singapore. It's impossible. The history of economic development shows you that it can't be done. You look at 20 other cities across the world. So you can actually think of a different way of actually governing. We use the South African example significantly in this. It may not be the best example in the world, but it works in some ways. And we showed him different ways of actually locating this, this gap. We looked at it quite some detail. The reason I'm showing you this is that this is maybe good or bad, how evidence and a whole range of different processes can be brought to bear in a deeply political process. Right? It's a cause and it still is. There's an election coming up, and some of the things that we predicted might actually come true in some sense. So these are 3 different locations that we gave him. Of course, he chose one. This is history in some senses, and we're trying to bring Singapore there, and pretty much something happened. One of the biggest land aggregations in the country's history that actually happened. There was a whole range of both positive and negative outcomes as far as concerned. But this is the final thing we did. Effectively, what we did, we put together a $75 billion investment plan on this process. We recognize the people from India are meeting. That's the negotiations with the person who's not the vice president on trying to figure out how the resources will go. So the reason I'm showing you this example is there is a tangible, in some cases, a one-to-one connection between the epistemic and the practice and the theoretical work, and how we can actually bring it to practice. Of course, once you actually go through that process, you get a sense of how you can bring it back and actually rebuild, the theory of how you do integrated development frameworks, how you do national or subnational policies, and other kind of processes. And that goes upon very minor things we're doing this now. So we're looking at, this is an interesting question, SDG 7. So it's about water and sanitation. We're trying to help one state government transform water and sanitation, maybe over this 5 or 6 or 7 years. I don't know, colleagues at the back are doing this, for about 20 million. So one of the challenges that we have in the work that many of us do as researchers, as applied researchers and people who work with the science and policies, We look at things in a particular scale, in a particular location, or we look at it in the high abstract. The question is how to bring those two things together and scale that out to impact, 5, at least in our country, 5, 10, 15, 20 million people. And if you don't do that 5, 15, 20 million people into 20 times, the system will not tick. The stuff that I was talking about on the climate side, or the stuff that we talk about on the poverty side, or on the infrastructure side, or the gender equality side, will not happen. Because the system is designed, it's unstable in some senses. So this is one example of something that we've been doing now for the last 2 or 3 years, where we're in the processes now of scaling up across this entire state. We started in 3 locations. We're going to be working on in 300 locations over the next 3 years or so. And in actually doing this, the question is, why should an academic institution like ours do this? Because you have to build the theory of how you actually do this to be able to educate the next generation of academics, researchers, and practitioners to make this happen. Many of us have never done this kind of stuff. Some of us have done it, but many of us have not done this kind of stuff. And this is true not only for our country where numbers are very large, but in others where the numbers are smaller, but you have a whole range of other contexts and processes. So I've just given you these 4 examples, starting from the big global process, going down to what happened nationally, to going down to what happened to the state level, all the way down to the city, and of course, I can take more time, which I don't have, to show you what happened at the sub-city level, because it's a connection between these processes, and the ability to bring back theory and practice between these things that gives us the basis of, in a sense, what we're talking about in New Urban Science. We don't have a very clear definition of what it means, and it's nice that it's that way. It's still fairly open. It's a place in which people from multiple disciplines can come in and cross and do a whole range of things. But it's very clearly a class of problems that is probably as important as some of the most serious scientific questions that we're trying to address today. What is the origin of the universe? Where is it going to go? What's happening at the subatomic level? What's happening in terms of neuroscience and cognition? These big questions that we try and address in science. This has also a very tangible impact on the lives of many of us. And like you can see in the climate space, it affects all of our lives. So it's a connection between what happens in your daily life and your professional and your personal life and everything else. So this is an intermediate space, which is very exciting in some senses for us to try and explore and deal with. And we muck around and try and apply the old methods and techniques we've learned in other spaces. Sometimes they work, and sometimes they don't. And I think part of what we're trying to do just now is trying to figure out what works in what places, and not jump into the canon too quickly and easily. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess if we are to think locally and learn globally in the spirit that Aro suggested, then we need to be slightly careful, I guess, about what we are saying about the theme of the city. And what Sue and I are going to do very briefly is give you some flavour of how we've come to this acronym, the P, the E, the A, and the K, because I suppose most straightforwardly what we want to argue is that part of that care that we need to recognise that Ravi Sundaram has made the point that we should remember that the ways in which we ended up with Chandigarh was when Corbusier flew over Rio and made sketches, and then over Algiers. This was an imaginary which created the city in a specific frame, which didn't always end up quite as well as it might have done. And even more recently, Rem Koolhaas actually defined Lagos as this confrontation of demography and infrastructure by flying in a helicopter. This way of thinking, way of seeing, we know is critiqued and discredited in all sorts of ways over time, but we would be very foolish, really, I guess, to ignore the sense in which the city performs itself, right? I mean, the city performs itself every day, and the exponential growth of data that comes out of the technologies that make that data visible actually throw light on, portray, describe, make visible a very different kind of city. And whilst being suspicious of the certain kinds of utopianism that might be present there, we have to kind of think through somewhere that goes slightly beyond that notion that we can capture the city as a straightforward object we understand. It is not a system as such. It is in a cliche of our times, if you like, a system of systems. It is systems poured one upon one upon It is transport systems, food systems, housing systems, economic systems, one upon another, and they move at different speeds. We know that most of the infrastructure, most of the built environment, certainly in large parts of the world, will be there for another 50 to 100 years. How do you retrofit that for the challenges that Aro was describing? So in thinking about that, I guess we need to understand the combination of forms of science that have an ability to grasp a future, whilst recognizing that the cities themselves are sometimes moving more slowly than we might recognize. There's a paradox of the new urban sciences, if you like. There is a sense that whilst there is this incredible facility to model, to analyze, to capture data in real time on a scale never witnessed before, and an ability to understand and predict over a short period of time, we also know that the power of disruptive innovation to turn technologies the other way, the mobile phone makes visible the citizen, but the citizen turns the mobile phone back on itself and creates a newly mediated kind of city. Those kind of disruptive technologies are accelerating so that our ability to predict beyond certain time periods has actually diminished at the same time as our ability to measure data has increased. What that means is we need to think very straightforwardly about how these complex systems that are open rather than closed, might work. And jumping through material in very quick fashion, what that means, if you think about systems as open systems rather than closed systems, there are some very straightforward principles. It means that the units of the systems are never repeated inevitably and over duration, because they produce new kinds of combination. Those kinds of combination capture this sense of emergence, things that emerge, which come both from the natural sciences, but also actually from discussions in the humanities and the cultural domain. It's also the case that we need to think about those systems as socio-material rather than just material or social systems. In that context, there's really kind of four arguments that inform the way we've put together the peak urban program. That actually, if we actually think about the reality of cities as open systems, then we need to recognize that in systems theory terms, we are always blessed by and cursed by simultaneously that what is known as the path dependency of cities. We actually make our own paths away from the shadows of our own histories. But those histories actually may, in a sense, capture a certain lock-in to certain technologies, and obviously the car in the context of what we were talking about before. And the sense of innovation needs to recognize and address those path dependencies. But we also need to recognize that those new forms of science, those traditional forms of science, make visible very different cities. If I want to make the city most suitable for walking and for cycling and for reducing diabetes and obesity, then the city that emerges will look something very different from if I'm trying to maximize flow and speed through the city itself. So there are both inevitably trade-offs between different kinds of logics of urban form, but also alongside those trade-offs, we need to recognize that measures of value and worth are significantly different in different disciplines. The engineering optimal creation of mass transit may be different from the socially optimal organization. There is a trade-off between the different forms of knowledge precisely because the measures of value and worth are different. And in that context, we need to think about the urban through a light that is both experimental, that actually recognizes that we are always trying things that will fail. In the spirit of Samuel Beckett, we fail again, fail better, but hopefully sometimes we do better than that. But alongside that, we need to try and make sure that there is that bridge between primary high-quality academic research and the cities themselves in terms of translating. That means in terms of what we're trying to do in Peak, there is a combination of a number of people in all of those 5 partners I talked about who are thinking through the importance of nonlinearity in mathematical terms, but also forms of data analytics and data science that actually can work with both the capacity of new forms of big data, but also think through that in very specific contexts, recognizing the kind of pluralization of data sources I mentioned earlier on. So that one might just give you a very, very quick flavor. One might think about actually trying to gather data that combines what on the slide is described as the Scrabble theory of development. That actually, instead of relying on conventional forms of measurement of both skill and task and economic units, actually tries to use new data sources to think through what kinds of combination and emergence might provoke urban development. That actually recognizes that complexity is frequently one of the strengths of the urban, rather than thinking of cities that are zoned straightforwardly by functionality. We know that the proximity of forms of economic difference can actually be one of the easiest measures of cities' adaptability. How we actually measure that might involve engaging with different sources of how we understand economic activity, precisely because the ways we think through a lens of the economics is always going to be hidebound by an old taxonomy. What is manufacturing? What is the primary sector? What is agriculture? These terms may not mean much in 100 years, precisely because new creations produce new taxonomies of how we think about the economic. So when we're thinking about somewhere like in China, the potential that Beijing will almost double by creating the new city of Zhong'an, that there is an importance to think about how what exists at present has a sense of what might be. The city that Malik Simone talks about is a city that is yet to come, the city that has a sense of propensity. In Mandarin, there is a notion that shi, which actually captures that sense of what something might become, given what is there in the first place. So one might use modeling techniques, like cellular modeling techniques, to create different forms of scenario that actually relate back to what is there in the context of what might be. And that gives you, if you like, the P of prediction, which is qualified by that paradox of urban science I talked about a second ago. There is a hubris in notions of prediction, as well as a reality to this kind of scale of the potential of what might be measurable and comprehensible. And when we think about that power of what might emerge, how newness emerges, there is, as I say, a combination, in a sense, of forms of natural science and forms of understanding of contemporary culture. The novelist Salman Rushdie always said that the city is the space where newness emerges through a pattern of hybridity and combination. Right? That kind of sense of what might be means that when we're thinking about the ways in which people move to cities, actually create a home, frequently shaped by those patterns of inequality that Aro touched on earlier on, it creates this sometimes problematic category of the informal juxtaposed to the formal, which in one sense characterizes the condition of the global majority, right? We know that. But at the same time, we are talking about contexts in which the appeals to how we think about the rights of those who have arrived and those who have yet to arrive have to be understood in terms of the very different appeals to constitutional rights in terms of squatter settlements in India, or how we think about what that means in terms of a history of diversity in contemporary Colombia and the barrios of Medellin, and how one thinks about accessibility in both a metaphoric sense of how people are integrated into the urban, but also how they are linked technologically in a sense that Sue will illustrate in a second. But also how in China the notion of the urban hukou creates a very different set of understandings between the public and the private, the rights of the individual to access basic welfare, basic education. In different places, a different kind of stratification of urban life. It means that the fundamental notion of how we think about the plurality of property rights actually structures the mutability of how the future of spaces like the ones in the slide might emerge in the future. But they can also learn from each other by recognizing the diversity that is fundamental to them. That sense of emergence leads on to the third and fourth terms of the acronym, the A and the K, which Sue is going to talk.
Thanks. I want to try and just help us all tie the dots together. So Arrow was painting that really big set of challenges, just enormous, overwhelming, and urgent, and nowhere exemplified better than in the Indian context, where if we can get it right here, we should be able to get it right anywhere. But the imperatives there of working across sectors, across scales, intellectually and proactively. And so in this project of peak, we're going to need many, many peaks if we are to begin to create the kinds of work, the kinds of practice, the kinds of urban transformation. And what Michael's done so far is to give you the first two letters of that. If you like, they're the nouns of peak. They're the descriptive activities. They're the intellectual acts of an entirely different way of looking at, thinking about, describing and knowing the future, knowing the present, knowing the relationship between now and the present, and using the technologies that we really do have at hand, but mindful that this is a live, a dynamic system, and it's a system which we are so often reminded is not always as the textbooks tell us it will be, and it pops up in our face when we have ignored, overlooked, or been blind to these emergent forms of urbanism. Okay? So the first two letters of peak are basically about the intellectual act of knowing, of describing, of understanding, of analyzing, and of perhaps doing that in a way that you wouldn't have found in big urban studies conferences over the last 2 to 3 decades. What sets, I think, the Peak Project apart is the kind of challenge that Arrow was setting out for us, was to say what's really, really important is that what we do from here is, can I have the buzzer? Thanks. What we do from here requires us not just to update, to renew, to innovate our intellectual capacities and skills and modes of operating, but to do so in ways that are mindful of the relationship between what we think and what we do. Okay, and so for those of you who are familiar with that old debate about housing, of housing as a verb, and housing as a noun, we're now moving into the cities as a verb part of the peak practice, okay, and that's the A and the K. Now, if you can just bear with me, it's a device, okay? It's, there are many ways to do this, but it's simply a way of making the point. What the A in the peak stands for is to say we know that we have distinctive scientific conversations, and we need to have those distinctive scientific conversations, both within the disciplines, but also about how cities as a whole are managed and how knowledge is absorbed, is taken up, is adopted, is incorporated. And critically, what we're interested in Peak is not just to accept that the conversation between engineers is different from the conversation between medics, is different from the conversation which ethnographers or anthropologists might have, but to rather think about what does it mean that there are those different conversations, given that, and some of you may even be those people, some people in cities land up putting those into practice. Now, they may be NGO activists, or they may be city planners, or they may be, in fact, financiers. But knowledge is, the assumption that we have is that knowledge, maybe that should be knowledgers, because it comes from these very different places that Arrow was talking about. Some of it is really based in kind of physics or chemistry. Others is the very latest in big data and thinking about technology. The knowledge that is used to design, to plan, and that should be or, to build, design, or plan, or build, or finance, or manage, or navigate, just to get around. You know, you take your granny around the city, I promise you, she does it differently from how you do it. And And it's not just because she does different things in the city. Okay, she both navigates the city for different purposes, but she does it in different ways. Those all become entrenched in our culture, in our politics. Women may or may not go on cabs. Why? Because we know things. Okay, the stats tell us that, but we also know those things, especially if you're a woman who's been in a cab, who's been in a bad place. Professions have modes of operating. I don't know if you've ever worked with an architect, but the way that they do things is not just about the fact that they come up with a set of drawings that they're going to submit to council for approval. They have a whole way of doing things that is very different from an advertising executive. They have a different way of doing things, which is fundamentally different from an SCI activist. Okay, so those things become embedded in norms and practices. And some of what we're saying in Peak is that over time and with struggle, these competing rationalities, because they are very different, have a way of getting embedded next to each other. Sometimes the contradictions are obvious, and you will even get a sign that will tell you two very different kinds of things. But together, they form what we might think of as an urban palimpsest. Okay, it's a document where things get layered on. Some parts remain, other parts don't. Okay, but cities, that's what makes place. It's what makes places lovely sometimes, but it is also their contradiction. What we're saying in Peak, though, and by implication what we're saying to the 1.5 community and to the argument that we need to make fundamental transformation, is that you will never achieve transformation, tipping point, at scale, until such time as you understand the adopted knowledge. What knowledge is in the system, how it got there, whose interests it represents, how it's reproduced, and how it can be made to change. This is a deeply political act as well as an intellectual act. If you only push through protest on the street, you're not going to get there. But if you only make the intellectual case and you don't win the hearts and minds, you're not going to get there. Okay, so the notion for us of adopted forms of knowledge is really both about deep methodological expertise. It's about a grounded political understanding. What's possible when you're talking about which state capital, okay, or choices. And an augmented systems approach, which helps to capture specific sectoral or technical dynamics of this adopted knowledge at the same time as it gets to grips with power. Okay, so this notion then of how these knowledges can be commensurate, how they may be incommensurate, how they can be changed, what can be changed in each city as well as across cities is what we're interested in. Okay, because we also know, as Ara already indicated, it's not just you do have to navigate locally. There is no choice. But bottom-up political activism is only one of the mechanisms through which you achieve transformation at scale. And so within the Peak process, what we're trying to do is to try and get people who are able to undertake research mindful of what knowledge means for the adaptation into the city system and the mode of managing and running the city. So, for example, we've got a whole lot of stuff about health. A couple of people in the room are part of the health programs. And the logic here is very simple, is that ideas about what makes for health and well-being have changed dramatically over time. We want to update how we understand the relationship between health and disability. We know, though, that the way that that works out in a city like Bangalore is not necessarily going to be exactly the same as it works out in the city of Cape Town. Michael made the point right at the beginning of just because there are local particularities does not mean that there are not some common principles. And we are looking for both. Okay? In other words, we need to be able to differentiate and to talk about that. And to do that, we need to invoke methodologies that are able to get us to that point of intellectual comparison so that we can make the case for institutional change. Very specific questions, that's one example. There are a number of examples in the PEAK program, and we're hoping that you'll look at our website if you aren't part of the PEAK project for later on. There's another one which I really like, which is the example of the relationship between social change and technology change and the use of technology. And we're very excited, a lot of the Colombians who will be joining us in PEAK have done exceptionally well. And you can have a squiz again at their websites, at drawing the link between how infrastructure works, how people get around the city, how data about the city is represented, and therefore what the experience of life in the city can be. Changes at scale made not necessarily through conventional modes of social mobilization. Totally, totally transformative in that way. So, PEAK has a focus on the A, but it also has a focus on the K. And what this effectively does is it says it's not good enough to do what Michael was suggesting, which is to be really smart intellectually, agile to new ways of thinking, alert to new processes of the urban that we have ignored. It's not even good enough to acknowledge the governance implications that Aromar highlighted and to know and to say, yes, governance is important. What we're saying in PEAK is that you actually have to be in the places where knowledge transfer takes place. And if you aren't in the places, you've got to make the places where knowledge transformation can take place. Okay? And that it really is a radically different understanding of what the science policy interface is. This is not science for policy. Yeah? It's not the translation of knowledge to tell people what to do. It is about making sure that the institutional conduits that exist are in the right size and shape, with the right kinds of people, absorbing the right kinds of knowledge in order to begin to make some of those shifts that deal with those projections, that deal with the predictions that we have got there, and that are able to absorb and to help people to navigate these contradictions that emerge from these very, very different forms of science. Now, in a way, that's what we've already started to do. It's very messy, as Aromar said. We're starting to do that at a number of different scales. Globally, the problem for the urban community, and that's really what that Nature Science report is about, is that you would imagine that you would get global leadership from a range of urban experts who are able to talk to each other about what would be the appropriate mechanisms to be putting in place. In fact, that's not what has happened. What we've got is a message and a value base which governments have signed up to without any kind of platform for the scientists or the policymakers to engage on the way forward. So something like PEAK then is almost a retrofit, okay, to say, well, perhaps we need to roll out these kinds of programs which will skill people up to fill these kinds of spaces in order to be able to take on these kinds of roles and tasks. And there's no question that the multilateral agenda on the urban question actually does make a difference. It changes the norms and values, and it does set out new processes. It lays down new adaptive mechanisms of reporting lines, which are changing the SDGs, which are changing the information that the census data collects, which will in turn change the politics, because we will have different kinds of information. That's already happening. Okay, the question is it happening in exactly the way that we want, need, and should it be better? Don't worry about the detail of it. This is simply to make the case that the next two slides show you that the difficulty for the urban question and why it is so important that at the level we are talking about now, that we talk to each other, is that globally, and this is mirrored nationally and locally, when you look at who is responsible for either leading or reporting on the urban question, it's unbelievably disparate, complex, and quite difficult to adjudicate, okay? So there are multiple places within the UN system where the urban thing emerges. There are multiple places in any national government, Treasury, various housing departments, welfare departments, all of which health department, all of whom have urban responsibilities, with generally very little mechanism for thinking about how those are brought together. And that compounds this real awkwardness of when you get to that adaptation of putting down the knowledge systems, of putting them in place. Typically what you'll end up seeing is a whole bunch of individuals or even groups of excuse me, groups of people pushing for reform, often to the detriment of the interests of others. Okay, and so one might even argue in the climate world that that's what's happened, where we've seen in the global south pushing for adaptation and very little on mitigation. Okay, so, you know, with the best of intentions, people basically did the wrong, I would argue, they made a reform that wasn't actually progressive in the longer term. Okay, that's just within the UN system. There are lots of opportunities and new opportunities, and in my mind, one of the ones which is possibly the most interesting, and I would encourage you to at least give it some thought, is the opportunity, and it is one of the places that we're thinking about in the PEAK program. Certainly the Cape Town group are doing it, and I think the Colombian group are thinking about doing it. I think there's some scope within the other cases that we're looking at to do the same, where what national urban policies are trying to do is partly because typically what happens in a city isn't controlled just from a city. It also comes from a national government. But national governments are typically in a slightly better position to look at linkages and coordination points. They also, in theory, have a better capacity to engage the science capacity. The problem for us as urbanists is that we are not typically very well represented in organized science in our countries. And so whereas the health professions, for example, are extremely well organized, you would never do anything without talking to the Medical Research Council. What is the Urban Research Council? Do we have, or whatever it's going to be called, okay? And one would think of equivalent kinds of bodies in all sorts of ways. And so I put to you that there are some really interesting opportunities for us to begin to think of in this K domain, not just for where do we put our research, but what do we think is missing, and what do we do about forging it? As activist intellectuals in the urban space, what needs to be made in order for the message to be heard about the imperative of interdisciplinarity, about the imperative of better projection and better prediction, of the imperative of taking on board those emergent forms of urbanism. Because if you don't have the vehicle to make the case, even when it is cogent, will not be there for people to absorb. I don't think this is a fact. This is probably the most important moment to be able to articulate a nuanced, radical urban agenda based on evidence. And the reason for that is that there is this extraordinary opportunity everywhere to look to the city as the opportunity for the future. Now, some of that is just quite simply that we're moving from a majority urban world to a majority urban world. In other words, if 75% of the population live in cities and you're not talking about cities, clearly what you're saying is not relevant. There is more than that, though. I think it is this global understanding that, like climate change, actually urbanization and urban growth is a fundamental driver of multiple components of the global system, whether it's the financial system, whether it's emissions, whether it's war, that cities really do lie at the heart of that. And it's in that context that there really has been this surge, really, of work. And this is I really like this set of reports, by the way, Michael. It does say Michael Keith in very fine print there with Nicola. But it's a reflection on what one might think of as a bottom-up movement of seeing cities as urban laboratories, of engaging in this kind of, and it doesn't happen in the same way everywhere, co-produced, translational, activist, applied, call it whatever you wish, okay? But a new mode of looking at the interface between knowledge and cities. And I'm going to end on this slide because it comes from our 5 cities that we've got. And it's just a word cloud made from the project proposals that everybody put in. And you can see that they all have similar concerns. They're nuanced, but there are some commonalities. And with that, Michael, I'm going to hand over to you to close us off.
It's almost literally the last word. I think you can't read the slide actually too well on. It's better on the back than on the side. Straightforwardly, the principle that we all recognise is we have no opportunity to avoid change. There's straightforwardly a reality that confronts us all, and in that context, we hope that the Peak Urban Programme will actually begin to address some of the challenges Aromar started at on the ground level, but also recognising that that will only be plausible if we actually combine some sense of the units through which these challenges need to be addressed. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, questions you want to? Okay, folks. So I know it's late, and it's been a long 3 days. But yeah, if there's some of you who are still alive and awake and willing to engage, then we're happy and I think refreshed, at least this side of the table. Comments, questions?
Have we reached a stage where we should rather jump out than jump in, since that's where you ended?
So didn't get that completely. Jump out from where? And
jump out from the mess that we're in.
Okay. Can we pick up another couple of?
I think, thanks all of you for really interesting and quite complex presentations. I think my fundamental question is this: that there were 2 articulations, one of Susan Parnell's, which suggested that there are strains of adopted knowledge and knowledges, and I guess even Michael Keith's presentation, and knowledge is built from ground up, and we're constantly adapting to that knowledge, whether as practitioners or as people who are studying the city, as ethnographers, whatever it might be. And then there was this massive big picture idea of projection and prediction and where we're going. And at some level, as I was looking at both sides of it, there seemed to be kind of fundamental disjunctures about what exactly is going on, and which is why this project in some ways is very exciting, but it's exactly what makes it really daunting. And I was wondering what just in terms of reflecting, and I know that there was some kind of ways in which people could move into policy and influence, whether state governments or whether it's national governments, but really at a kind of theoretical level, how do we bridge these 2 facets which seem quite contradictory, at least in my head?
On the question of have we got to the point where we can jump out of this mess yet? It relates to the second question. My answer will, I think, relate to the second question. I think for me there are slightly different levels. The scalar lens is useful here. You see it in cities with transportation problems. They get worse and worse, or air pollution problems. They get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, and then everybody suddenly goes, oh my God, this is so awful. It really is worth our while actually beginning to do something to change. And I have that sense for cities as a whole, is that there there becomes a point when really it is worth the pain of making the major challenges required to fix, whether that's the outbreak of plague or air pollution or whatever it is, that violence that prompts that. So I think at an individual city scale, the answer will be yes sometimes and perhaps not on the same trajectory. I have a slightly bigger concern though, and it relates a little bit, I think, to the point that you were making, which is around what happens to the composite of cities. Okay, and what Peak, I think, is really interesting about is that we are concerned with particular cities, Bangalore being one of them, but we are also concerned with the general urban condition. And it is that which I think underpins things like the 1.5 argument. It is that underpins the urban insertion of the SDG into a wider global agenda. And my concern is that whereas at the city scale, in many but not all parts of the world, and Africa I think is different, and I'll come back to it in a second, we are getting sufficient expertise that if we wished to, we would know what to do to make a difference. I'm not sure that's true in the African context, where we simply have not trained enough people with expert knowledge to be able to do some basic things like monitor air pollution. But it's not true at the global scale. And because we are organized politically, not just around our own individual cities, but around our own individual national interests, it's very difficult to reach a common global urban good.
Very briefly, in terms of, we live, I think, in a world of tensions and contradictions, and I think to avoid that in an old language, we always have to be asking ourselves, I guess, in whose image is the city being remade, which creates inevitably tensions, it creates trade-offs, it creates a balance between the different public goods that we may aspire to. But in terms of the kind of what I suppose that might capture both the sense of what you're saying, but also what hopefully we were communicating was that we are suspicious of the major claims to projection of big futures of the urban, but we are not afraid of the science of the climate change that Arrow described. And so in addressing that, we need to recognize that paradox of urban science, that prediction is incredibly real, and a capacity from the Fitbit that we wear on our wrist and that measures the data that means we are all prisoners of Silicon Valley potentially through the devices we use, but also the nudges that change our behavior. That all of those forms of technological change are creating a different relationship between data and humanity, which actually are measurable in real time and over certain periods of time actually can be subject to incredibly accurate powers of prediction. So that balance between scientific possibility and social hubris creates, in a sense, a tension that we all have to live through, I think. If that makes it.
I mean, to misquote McLuhan in some senses, the mess is the message. That especially in our context, in some ways, many of us are educated or trained to think about certain forms of order and form, which is not the way the system actually is, and especially because it's emergent and it's increasingly interconnected. And we've seen, I guess, in many of our lives, just in communication and access, how things have changed. And this is the whole debate about informality as a very inadequate category that actually mixes in a whole range of things, and there are many more dynamics inside that. So actually, in some senses, engaging with that mess, enabling the mess in some senses, looking at the informal settlement within courts as actually a solution rather than a problem in some senses is one way of dealing with it. But having said that, what Sue said and what I think was implicit in what you're saying is there's some things that are beyond the bounds of biophysical reality or whatever it is, and there's some real bounds there which will lead to considerable harm and loss and processes, and we need to be able to unbundle that. And in some cases, there will be normative and other ways of looking at that question. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do in this sort of complex emerging network is to try and define where those spaces are, and at least engage with them in let's say geographic and temporal context, where we can actually try and make some sense which is then replicable. And that's within quotes what the science is about. But I think one of the tensions that are really here in the room is, if you look at the SDGs come from a universalist framing, which comes from a universalist idea of knowledge, which is tied back to a particular renaissance. So like we have knowledges, I would say at the current point of time, and this is a debate that comes in from Asia in some senses, is this might be a time for another one, but it wouldn't be the same context in some ways. So even if we're looking at how knowledge is constructed in this room, I would think there are at least 2 or 3 sub-narratives. In this country and otherwise, there's an essentialist way of responding to the problem of projection. So that, you have a data and whatever it is. So you obviously have to deal with an emergent non-linear reality. You can take an essentialist way of dealing with it, which basically says that all the stuff is inside, and you can rediscover it, and you can recreate and reproduce patterns of the past and other ways of doing things, and you'll find the answers. And there are deep problems and also opportunities in that space. There's also, I would say, sort of another discourse in the room, which really talks at a very hard, sort of realist frame. And when I opened it, I did that with that kind of a rhetoric. There's also a constructivist way of looking at this thing. I mean, I'm just putting this out as 3 different ways of trying to engage with this challenge. I'm not talking of it as a dialectical challenge, but it's like, there's a potential difference between those 2 things, and how do you bring them together? So I think one of the things that we need to explore, or we have the potential of exploring in this sort of mashup of disciplines, is just looking at how those discourses build out in this space. And they will contest, and we're hoping that the sort of hybrid conversations that happen in these particular places and these knowledge cultures will actually help us sort of move a little bit forward in that. But yes, this is exactly what Michael started with. There are deep, sort of, within quotes, dichotomies and multiple dimensions in the space. And we're trying to explore them, to try and concretize them, and try and explore how we can use multiple lenses to look at them. So, please.
So, thank you very much for the presentation, and it's late and there's a lot of ideas to try and absorb here. This is going to be a question about how to distinguish your framework and the concepts that are being put forward from the ideas and the concepts that are put forward in the Keto papers. And the ideas coming from Juan Close and Sassen, Ricky Burdett, and who's the 4th one I'm forgetting right now? In that framework, you're now giving us this assemblage of urban knowledges that somehow we have to find a way to bring together in some type of a conversation that is then going to be the secret recipe for getting us through the 21st century. And it seems that their notion of open system urbanism is having a very similar conversation. So is there a way that you can identify, is this the same conversation, or is this something distinct? Now, to me, what's important is that their conversation is a rejection of high modernism and of the Charter of Athens. And what's particularly interesting is that Juan Close led the process of the formation of Habitat 3 and the New Urban Agenda, and the Keto papers can be read as an explicit rejection of what came out of that process. Yet here we start the conversation, right, with a firm footing, right, in one of the spaces of knowledge, the SDGs, which is way on the extreme, right, of technocratic rationality, instrumental reasoning, and it's basically more of the same way of thinking, an epistemic that caused the problem to begin with. Right? Yet, it doesn't seem that you're willing to depart from that. Whereas the Quito Papers seems to be pretty firm in its rejection of it. Now, which path are we supposed to follow?
That's a really, really interesting comment and question. Thank you. And I think that it would be really worthwhile to push that further. My own view of the Quito Papers is that there are internal contradictions in them. Partly because, and for those of you who've read them and know where the people writing are coming from, there's a contradiction on the one hand where it's a kind of an elitist, design-oriented understanding of a city that is a very particular version of a city and what makes for urbanity. And on the other hand, it's an absolute rejection of institutions and politics. Or at least it's an implicit, it's not an absolute, it's an implicit turning away from the labyrinth of the multilateral system, of indicators, and the mess that goes with that. And I have some sympathy with that. And if you have spent any time trying to navigate some of those things, as indeed Jan Kloss had done at the moment of writing it, you begin to understand where that comes from. That said, he was also very instrumental in the reworking of Barcelona, which is the ultimate modernist project and top-down driven project. And someone like Ricky Burdett comes from a very design-oriented tradition. What I think is really useful about that piece, though, and about the work that they have there, is that what they reinsert and what they bring to the conversation is the discussion of the city. Okay, and I think what I think is happening more generally and what the value of that intervention is that we're moving out of the conventional urban development space where ideas of cityness were unimportant and it was only ideas of urban poverty or of basic services that were important. And they've reinserted the notion that cities have to work as a whole, that there is something about urbanity, that there is something about morphology and the physical form that is something we would strive for, and that citizens make those places. So I suspect that there's contradictions on both sides, and for me what's really important collectively is that we get to the point where we're able to have a more coherent dialogue. Personally, I'm happy to embrace the contradictions of modernism, and I acknowledge the contradictions of modernism. But frankly, given the mess that we are in, I can't see that we're going to get a bottom-up only solution.
I guess in the one point I might add to that is that, I mean, we started with that complex open systems perspective, and I think a very large element is shared. But I think it captured in the question was the point that I think the author you missed was Juan Close, who was also the protagonist in generating the policy framework that you were saying was antagonistic, right? Which has its own set of implications. But I think most straightforwardly as well, one of the problems with the Quito Papers in part is that if you elevate a singular notion of urbanism at the heart of a future, then I think you're beginning to, however well-intentioned that singularity is, it will have a logic that will be deeply problematic. Because if the crisis of climate change is universal, then the responses to that have to be distinctive in Quito, for that matter, or Shanghai, or London, or Bangalore, precisely because of the logic of the path dependencies which those documents both embrace, but then almost refuse to acknowledge, I think, in the specific.
Hi. So the knowledge that's produced is highly dependent on the data that's available. And we are dealing with one deficiency in data in informal settlements that I study. And there's also the problem of homogenizing of data. Sometimes it's the definitions that's used to collect data. And I know the panel has already recognized this in some of the papers that you've written, and you're calling it the poverty of urban science. So what are your ways to deal with it? Do you have some answers?
For me, one of the most exciting parts of the peak framing is this idea of what's emergent. And I really like the fact that we're working in largely middle-income cities, because the more general southern critique, which was easy to make because it was so appallingly obvious, was that basically the way that 50% of the world's urban residents lived had been completely ignored in the urban literature. Keto papers are probably quite a good example of that. But which, to be fair, Urban Age have tried very actively to begin to kind of wind back on. And I think the recent meeting in Alice was really fascinating, because it produced a dialogue which was much more sophisticated and focused on conventional urban questions, drawing from places on the African continent, which demonstrated that it was perfectly possible to do. But which speaks to your question for me of when we look for what is emergent in cities, it's not just a question of surfacing the lives of the subaltern. That's clearly quite an important part of it, of people who've been ignored, their narratives haven't been brought to the surface. But there are a whole lot of other variables which are really, really significant too. We haven't, if you took places like Medellin or Cape Town, and I don't know enough about Bangalore to be able to say, the systems which are used to manage city processes have not been interrogated at all. They are not studied, there is no data on them other than that what is held by private companies. So the emergent urbanisms there may well be in investigating elite corporate practices in urban places, and that may turn out to be what's emergent. But I think that's the intellectual responsibility of holding practitioners to account, not just working with practitioners. And I'm hoping that at least in the PEAK program that we have people who push back against and don't just collaborate with people on the ground.
Just to first pick up on the data question, I think one of the big things that's changing just now, because of both the nature of information technology and also the recognition of a whole range of new ways of non-literate knowledge. For example, I mean, the web in India and even in written literature is expanding exponentially in the non-English domain. It's also exponentially expanding even faster in the oral domain, which means that there are new ways of being able to connect and generate knowledges which have not been recognized and have not been sort of accessible both to the protagonists themselves and certainly to the research community. So I mean, this is literally there's an below the surface iceberg which is churning and producing a lot of stuff. So I think there's tremendous potential there, and things that we find most interesting, for example, are the mobilization of informal workers, slum dwellers across this country and otherwise, actually generating data which is useful to themselves and not necessarily available to public and other systems, because in some senses that those become arenas of contest. So these are new areas of knowledge creation which are not only real and expanding, but also deeply legitimate. The question, of course, is whether the state and other systems consider them legitimate, and whether our forms of canonical knowledge consider them adequate enough for professionals to work with. So I think there's a big set of changes coming there, and the more that we engage with those questions, the better it is. And so, biophysical stuff, et cetera, is interesting. But I think the other thing, of course, is something that I don't think we have any lack of, is myth creation. And that is a space in which, public culture and a whole range of people within quotes, because of both social media and otherwise, are actively shaping our imaginaries and our realities of how urban living, working, etc., are playing themselves out. So that's being constructed at the current point of time. And for example, an area that to my mind is deeply unexplored and very important is, how does that shape questions of power and politics? We don't have mechanisms and, let's say, metrics and processes to adequately engage with these questions. So, what I'm saying is that things are changing very quickly. We have to start exploring these things. And let's say social scientists can't do this without data scientists. They can't do it with other people who understand how technology actually works. And there are a whole range of new conversations that we're hoping to try and sort of open up in this space. And then to quickly, respond to the, or try to respond to the question about the Quito papers, etc. Let's say, but 2 or 3 things. The first thing is, I think for a large part of the world, especially practitioners and policymakers in many parts of the global south, the Quito papers were a non-event. So if you ask people in China, people in South Asia, maybe in some parts of Latin America and Africa, they didn't even notice that. Why? Because it's, in some senses, it's seen as, Janus-like one face of the modernist articulation that you found in Corbusier's work earlier, in a different context, but in a sense relatively irrelevant to the dynamics that are playing themselves out. And how would you judge that? Because many of these cultures are focused on delivery and performance and actual change. It is because the political process that led to the new urban agenda was actually a failed process. It actually led to no political consensus, even though I completely agree with you that the SDG frame is technocratic, it's top down, it's the next version of what the MDGs did. Yeah, there was a political consensus that was forged for whatever it was within a small club, even though it's a multilateral system. And similarly in Paris, especially because the French put so much of diplomatic energy into the process. So there was I think a fundamental misreading of the politics of the moment. And the reason why I'm saying that is, the politics of the moment, the deep politics of the moment, is potentially about the contest between the imagination of governance of the nation state and those that are emerging from other forms of organization. And neither the Quito process, neither the new urban agenda embrace that. And that's where, if you do that in East Asia, it doesn't matter. It's just another tome that will go into the shelf and it will be gone. But if it actually becomes part of a practice and can change what's happening, then people will sit up and notice and maybe even try to experiment with that in one small provincial town, etc., etc. And that might actually sort of bobble up to the top in Beijing or otherwise. So I think that's a very important question to sort of further interrogate. But in some senses, I suspect that that's a dead letter in this space. But a good thing to build on. Because extinction is a great way of trying to look at evolution in some senses.
I have a question. So the overall narrative of all the sustainable development goals is basically of good intentions and good motives. But for instance, Peter Schwartz and Doug Randall made a climate change report of how the US will prepare itself, and they use anti-fragility instead of resiliency and so on. I'll keep my question short. How important and consequential are the political motives in this narrative of facing climate change?
I think in 2035 we're going to be seeing a massive critique of the SDGs. Massive, probably before then. However, I think that history will also show that there are a set of fundamentally new metrics that have been introduced that exist, just as Beijing introduced the metrics on gender, which now form part of our everyday statistics everywhere in the world. We will have devolved metrics at subnational level, which will fundamentally change the way that nation states politics and money is allocated. And I think that there is, if you look back on issues which made it into the list of SDGs rather than those that didn't, it will be important to see that my anticipation is that even if done badly, the profile will be very much higher than it would otherwise have been. And so, for example, the question of devolution is back on the global political agenda. And for places like Africa, that is huge, huge.
Yeah. A one-sentence response would be that, the political is enormously significant, but that there can never be a politics of guarantees, I think. So, and I think the point has to be that the very nature of the political is about an argument about something. And the intervention can be the something, which is not to trivialize the SDGs, but it is to be, I think, open about how we think about the political and the sorts of debate that we can have, precisely because if we are to avoid simplistic technocratic specifications of solutions to X, then it's more about a constant debate around a particular pole or set of poles, I think, which is not to gainsay what you're saying at all.
So we exhausted the evening? Okay, one last brave.
So, thanks a lot for this, I think, wonderful panel, and I think it was just so nice to just think at this multiple levels. And I was just, I think it's a quick question in the sense that I was just wondering about, I think so much of the peak, I think different dynamics is about, I think problematizing certain intellectual division of labor, and which have I think so many of the problems I think don't get resolved because people don't communicate. The dialogue is an issue. And there's so much power relations built around dialogue, and in that sense I think there's a disciplinary dialogue not possible, though I think everybody talks about transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary in that sense, but I think there's so much power, status thing associated with that. So in that sense I was just thinking that when we talk about new urban science, could peak urban program be a paradigmatic case? Because in that sense, I think you're bringing people from different disciplines in this peak urban program. Could this be a paradigmatic case to move from new urban science to new science, where I think the other science take that as an instance to start reflecting about the histories of their disciplinary histories and their commensurability and incommensurability within. So I think could it be more than, I think the peak urban program, the focus is on cities in that sense, and just bringing all kind of expertise, building conversation with them, practitioner and everything. But could it be, I think in certain sense, be reflective on the science itself?
If it wasn't important, we wouldn't try. And I think that's the spirit of the endeavor.
You shifted from Rajasthan, Rajasthan being our window to the world and Gujarat being the vibrant model of this country, to come to Andhra Pradesh. I just want to know really whether all the zero budgeting and the so-called banking reforms that have been introduced into that state, do they still hold? Is that becoming our new role model state of India?
So you're talking about Andhra Pradesh?
Yeah, since that was the model that you had.
Oh, okay. That's from some of Andhra's fundamentals are pretty poor. So I'm not sure, that's Telangana is doing better in some cases. So, but if you look at the fundamentals, even fiscally, Andhra is doing pretty badly. I don't know how it's going to play itself out in the politics, but yeah, it's not doing. At least the Rump Andhra is not doing as well as it could have done. It's certainly not taken the path. I mean that it could have done. It's probably underperformed in many ways. Yeah. And to your thing, I guess you're asking a question that a postdoc in whatever it is in 2035 will ask in the philosophy of science, or a historian of science would ask. We can look back and look at all the messes that we created, whether it was Corbusier flying over X, Y, and Z, or what happened in Athens or Quito, or what we're doing. I mean, we can't really judge that. That's what the paradigm shift is all about. Yeah, it's about the first dinosaur that grew feathers before it started to fly. The other dinosaurs have no clue, like we do, of exactly what's happening. Okay. So shall we close then? Is that good? Yeah. Good. Thank you very much. Thank you for the attention. Pleasure.